All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the official podcast for A Step Ahead Adoption Services. Once again, this is Dr. Andy Benanti, and with me today I have Whitney O'Connell, one of the A Step Ahead Adoption Services adoption coaches, and Valerie Marble, the owner of A Step Ahead Adoption Services. Much of the conversation will gather Whitney's experience on the home study process, but Valerie will take us home at the end of the call to talk a little bit about how a step ahead adoption can help families through their home study process. Whitney's worked in the field of adoption for over 28 years. She was actually just chatting with us about how she can answer all these questions no problem because this is her life. This is what she's lived.
Yes.
She has helped families through the home evaluation process, counseled birth parents, co-managed an adoption agency for 14 years. So Whitney and I both share a passion for education. We're excited to help inform our audience today about how to prepare for your home study.
Yes.
So Whitney, you're on.
Oh,
What
no.
is an adoption home study and why is it a critical part of the adoption process?
Perfect. The home study is, first of all, it's the initial step of really any adoption. Besides your research and getting to the point in the decision making, for any private, domestic, international step or second parent adoption, you are required to complete an adoption home study. And what that is, it's an evaluation of the perspective of adoptive parents, their home, their background. It goes into multi levels of supporting documents, but I like to call it it's a real give and take of information, a gathering of information to put into what is called the home study, the home evaluation report. So it's all encompassing of interviews, supporting documents, counseling, education. It's really the first step in beginning any kind of adoption.
Thank you. Perfect response. I like that you really shared that it's like overarching, involved with most things. I remember, and I've gone through the home study process a few times. Um, Different in with each agency, but I know some of the requirements were just surprising, like a fire extinguisher, right? That's a
Yeah.
good safety measure to have, but I
Yeah.
never thought about it, never had one until I went through the home study. So
Most people are the same way.
yeah. Okay, so what are some key components of a home study assessment and how can families prepare for the social worker's visit? Maybe
Sure.
get a fire extinguisher, right?
Yeah, exactly. Um, so the key components of any home study, you're going to be meeting with a caseworker. So there will be interviews with family members, the prospective adoptive parents. There is a home visit that's required. Not all of the meetings take place in the home. Um, there is also a collection of documents from a checklist that is put together by the state that they live in and their specific adoption agencies, list of documents that they want. Um, Also, there's education components. If there are any kind of outsourcing or resources that are required that are discovered during the home study process, that's generally what a caseworker would recommend. Like if someone needs to um, get into counseling or do some more education, things like that. It's pretty much the caseworker is working with each family specific to their needs, but there is a baseline of what is required, and that's under the statutes of adoptions in each state, their adoption laws. And how families can best prepare for the visits. When you're going into the home, of course, you want your home to be tidy. It does not have to be white glove service kind of clean, but things should be organized in sort of an orderly manner. There does not have to be a nursery or a child's bedroom set up per se, because most of the time that may be coming down the road 6 months to 12 months to 18 months down the road. So most of the time it's not expected that there's a nursery or childproofing in place, although the caseworker may go over some of those things. So really it's just preparing your home as you would having someone come in to look at it and making sure it, things are kept up and look presentable, basically. But it doesn't have to be perfect.
Thank you. So your response was perfect, and I feel like I've heard that. That's how you prepare. But I just want to share with everyone this checklist that Whitney so eloquently said. It's just a checklist is extensive. So get ready, be prepared. I feel like they wanted everything to include my firstborn. They wanted tax returns. They wanted proof of a medical exam. So there are relationships and things that you can start to get organized, like making sure that you have all the paperwork to support with your whatever your financial institutions are, good record keeping, making sure your tax documents are easily accessible, maybe going as far as the last 3 years, making sure that you have primary care doctors. That was one of the things that I remember. They're like, oh yeah, you just have to go get a physical. And I'm like, I don't even have a primary
Yeah.
care doctor. So those will help too. And I know every state's a little different, but I love the term checklist, Whitney. That was
Yeah.
perfect. Yep, there's just a little checklist, no problem.
Well,
So
small 2-page,
yeah, exactly right. Small 2 pages. It doesn't go on to the third. You'll be fine.
yeah.
Okay. How can prospective adoptive parents prepare emotionally for a home study and what they'll expect in terms of the timeline? Because I think even when we just talked about that checklist, um, you know, I like to be organized. I'm like, oh yeah, checklist. I'll get it back to you by Friday, which
Right.
was not the case.
Right. I have been told that multiple times, I'm afraid. Um, I think as far as preparing for the home study, I mean, before you get to even that stage, you have to really decide that adoption is where you want your path to go. I've met with multiple families. They are completely motivated, ready to jump in. They have put put other things on the back burner or closed those chapters. I've also met with families that aren't quite 100% on board with adoption, and it's very telling, their motivation or just maybe their responses. They're still maybe holding out to try to have a child biologically, which is perfectly fine. But in my experience, it's very hard to do both at the same time. And a lot of times agencies won't allow that. They have policies in place that you need to not be pursuing actively infertility measures and things like that. So I would say maybe the first thing is to get to the point where you are, you know, on board 100% both partners, because that's also something that you need to be able to come to the table together. So I would say that would be a great first step is really looking at yourself and soul searching and making sure that this is the right path for you to become a parent. And then after that, being as open and honest and forthright is the best approach with your caseworker. If a family is not and they try to, or if they don't disclose information, and it will be found out, that is the right, the agency or the caseworker has the right to refuse approval of the home study if something is not disclosed initially, whether it's a criminal background or a medical or child protective service. That will be discovered through all the different clearances and interviews and things that go on. So if a family isn't honest about something, that's the right for dismissal. So I would just say, being open and knowing that there will be a lot of invasive questions, some autobiographies that you have to complete. There will be individual interviews, counseling. It is that process. There is a reason for that to go on. We're trying to look, making sure that these are the best candidates to adopt a child. So there's no reason to not be as open and honest as possible. And just know that your caseworker is not out to get you. They're not doing anything. I try to let people know that that's the last thing that I'm trying to do is I'm literally following the code of adoption laws in my state. That's all I'm charged with, my responsibility. But at the end of the day, I'm approving them to adopt a child. So it's on me to make sure that I have covered everything and we've discussed everything. So it's not the time to be um, holding back or elusive about information. That's just not going to be productive in completing a home study. The timeline is really difficult to say. On average, you could probably finish a home study in 4 to 6 weeks if you're able to do that checklist that we talk about very expeditiously, and you have time in your schedule to uh, make time for the meetings. I've worked with people. I've done a home study in a week, 7 days. I've also worked with clients, and it's taken them over 2 years just to complete the 4 meetings and that checklist of documents. So it really is self-paced. If you're motivated, if you can get the documents together, meet with your doctor and go and get your criminal background, have time in your schedule to have the home visit and the other um, interviews, it can be done within, I'd say, about 6 to 8 weeks is on average. Again, if there's a timeline where something has to be moved up, you can expedite. And certainly if something comes up in your professional life or your personal life and you have to take a break, that's fine. Communication is key as far as that timeline and keeping your caseworker abreast of what's going on with paperwork or personal issues or job projects that come up, child sick, something like that.
And I just want to echo something that you said, Whitney, because I think it just really resonates with me. Uh, don't be afraid to be honest, and it's not a I got you process. And I say that, and I'll lean into my own personal experience in that when I was going through the home study process, I served in the military, and that military time, there seems to be, gaps. And I don't really talk about it because there's gaps. And that was one of those things that our social worker just questioned and said, I'm concerned about these gaps. So I'd really like you to be evaluated um, through therapy or counseling. Uh, and certainly that seemed like an invasion. And I could have sidestepped that by not sharing those or not being honest. But at the end of the day, I just felt better and more confident after going through all of that and receiving the clearance. And it was just a couple more line items to that checklist we keep talking about.
Right.
But it helped that relationship with my social worker. And even to this day, I've shared these podcasts with her, and we continue to stay in touch. But that is all built on honesty and trust.
For sure.
So, and we've already touched on some of these.
Yeah,
What documents, paperwork, background checks are required for the home study process? And I know it'll differ depending on the state the individuals reside in.
it does. But I'd say on average, like I keep referring to this, each state has a code of adoption laws. And with that, they have what they require and the timeline and what documents. It's a basic background investigation of your health, your financial situation, your family backgrounds, employment verification. So things that come into play as far as documents, basic copies of birth certificate, marriage certificate, divorce decree if that applies, insurance card, health insurance, driver's license. We require employment verification, tax returns, reference letters from at least 3 to 5 individuals. Some of those are family members, some are not. If you've worked with children, we'll also need reference letters on if you've worked with children. I think in the last 5 to 10 years, you'll have to complete a financial statement, and the supporting documents for that are possibly a mortgage statement. Sometimes they want to look at your checking and savings. Again, the tax returns. Um, then there's the background checks, and they're very extensive. You will have a statewide background check. I'm in Colorado, so you'd have to do a Colorado background check. You also have to do an FBI background check. There's something called the Adam Walsh Child Protective Services Child Abuse Registry check, and that goes back 5 years. So if you've lived, like, let's just say I'm in Colorado. If I've lived in Colorado for 5 years, I would only have to produce one Colorado child protective or child abuse clearance. If I've lived in multiple states, you'd have to go back to each of those states and get that background check. If you're doing an international adoption, those go back to the age of 18. So those are, layers and layers of additional clearances that are done. Each agency will then do some of their own in-house background checks. Like in Colorado, we do one that's called a Trails. There's a sex offender website for both national level and the state level. Again, some of these are done by the adoptive parent where they're going to get these clearances done. They're going to get their fingerprints done. And then some they're just providing, maybe signing off on.
Looks like we may have lost Whitney. Oh, and she's back. Thanks
So
for rejoining, Whitney. No
I am
problem.
so sorry about that. I took a little tiny break. Sorry. I don't know how to work the call forwarding. Anyways, but no, so the I was just talking about the background checks. They're just some of those will be you'll gather them yourself, and then some you'll sign off on it like a HIPAA form or a release, and then the agency will produce some of those. But it's all very carefully spelled out in that wonderful checklist of documents that we talk about. So that is on every agency's website, and you'd be able to go, and the forms are there. Usually it's something that you can download, print off. That's what I tell my clients when they first start the home study is get the checklist, print off all the forms, print off the checklist, and then start looking at what you have. A lot of times you have multiple line items in your home office or your records, like birth certificates and things like that. Set those aside, make those copies, and then start working on the things that might take a little more time, making a doctor's appointment, scheduling for fingerprinting. And then the other thing I would recommend too is creating a folder system, a filing system where you have a file of your own original documents, but then you also have a file of copies that you can give to not only your agency, your caseworker, or if you're using a different placement agency for your adoption, which I don't want to blow people's mind, but it's good to have a couple of files, folders, so that you have these documents in multiple places. And some people even upload it to a cloud or a jump drive or a Google something or other, so that you can have those even more handy if you're traveling out of state, that you can have everything in one location. So,
Well, we appreciate that. I know it sounds overwhelming,
yeah.
but from someone that moved around quite a bit and the state requirements, sometimes they're state, sometimes they're county. I remember having to get background checks with several different locations, but I was one of those that was within 4 to 6 weeks. So you can do it if you stay organized.
Yes.
Just follow the checklist and make sure that you're keeping everything in line. Completely doable. Don't be overwhelmed. It
Right.
sounds like a lot right now, but don't be overwhelmed. And I will say the social workers, they do a great job of presenting everything with a pretty little bow on it, to adequately prepare you on what your marching orders are. So that's very helpful as well.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the common misconceptions about home studies and how can families navigate them?
Sure. I think, people think that someone's coming into their home and expecting them to be perfect. Like they have, their house is all organized and together. And if they had a white glove, like I mentioned earlier, there would not be a scrap of dust. You have to have a huge house, or you have to have big buckets of money. You have to be an expert on parenting. You have to be an expert on adoption. None of that is true. We're not looking for perfect people. No one is. And you don't have to be an expert on adoption or parenting. This is part of the process is learning about some of that information, whether it's adoption information or newborn parenting skills. You have to have enough room in your house for yourselves and family members living there and an additional child or children. You also have to have the means to support not only the people in your house right now and bills, but a child coming in, and that requires daycare and diapers and formula and stuff. So, every family is looked at upon a case by case basis. So I've worked with families that are, getting funding from other resources, and I have families that could probably adopt 100 children, and that what we're looking at is each family and their ability to complete the requirements, but also what they have to offer a child through adoption. So it's really looked at to each family, what they have to bring to the table. Yes, there is that standard, the checklist. Those have to be completed. Everyone has to complete that. But anything over and above that, we're addressing to each family's characteristics, their strengths, where maybe they can work on some things. So no one's looking to be perfect. You don't have to be this expert, read every book on adoption. You'll learn all of those things throughout the home study while you're preparing for your child and while you're parenting that adopted child. So
So you mentioned something that I feel as though I was not well prepared for. So I'm just going to throw it out here or reiterate what you said. Daycare. Daycare costs are something that we really need to anticipate. So I would encourage anyone listening that's going through this process and they're going to go through the home study, really take a look at what that looks like in your area, because it can really differ from one area to the next. But we're talking weekly expenses that sometimes can be as much as a person's paycheck, bi-weekly paycheck. So again, I would just encourage you to explore those and um, maybe even consider, once you match, to get on a wait list if you are going to be using daycare early in that child's life, because I know that that was something that we had to wait for within our family.
good point.
Andy, I'm glad that you said that too. I'm going to chime in here about the whole wait list, because that was something with daycare that we were not prepared for. Was, we live in a smaller rural area, and oh my goodness, the wait list is months, if not years long. So, sometimes I would even suggest potentially getting on a wait list when you decide you want to adopt, or once you start the home study process, if your daycare facility allows for that, because there's definitely a need for daycare out there. And yeah, that's not something you really think about until you are in need of it.
Yeah, so feel free to pursue a career in early childhood education to get more daycares out there.
Right.
Okay, what are some home safety requirements that agencies typically look for, and how should families prepare for those? We've already talked a little bit about fire extinguishers. I know I also have a ladder upstairs in case of fire.
Yes.
But Whitney, I'll turn it to you.
So this is going to be real specific for each state. Some states have very, very specific safety requirements. I know, like Texas, for one, they require um, not only an evacuation plan, but they want a map of your house, multiple different levels of safety precautions for fire safety. But the basic things would be, yes, to um, fire extinguisher, fire safety alarms, carbon monoxide, and those are on each level of the home, usually outside of a bedroom. They More states are turning to having an evacuation plan in place. Some want it to be typed up and positioned somewhere near a safety exit door. So you may have to go to that length. Um, there's also, if you have a pool or some type of water, access to water in your home, we're going to be looking at safeguarding those items, whether it's fencing around the pool, obviously, or safety locking doors and gates exiting the house. Also, gun safety is huge. So there will be, if you have a gun in your home, that's fine. It just has to be locked in a gun safe. Usually that gun safe has ammunition separately. And that will have to be something that's done and prepared for before the home visit. And even with a pool, I've had families say, oh, I don't have a fence around my pool. I live on 25 acres. Well, they're going to have to build that fence before we can approve them for a home study. The pool and those kind of water um, things have to be safeguarded. Other things, people want to know, do I have to have a room set up? Do we have to have child-proofing measures in place? When you're doing a private home study for a domestic or international adoption, usually that does not come into play. If you were doing a foster care home study, which is kind of a whole separate entity, there's a whole different list of checklist items for the home visit. So we don't require in most cases that outlet covers or baby gates are put up, or chemicals are put up on different levels. It's always a great idea to start some of that, because when your child does start moving around, you feel like your house is basically, an accident waiting to happen. I remember when my daughter, who's now 18, started crawling. I think I was back and forth to Babies R Us for like an entire 2 weeks just to make sure every single corner in the house was safeguarded. So, some of this stuff you will do along the way, but it's not necessarily required for the home visit, because people are usually getting an infant or a baby that may or may not be mobile. But the big ticket items like safeguarding your home, if you have water or some type of pond or pool, the gun and gun safety, and then also, of course, like fire prevention. You have your fire alarms working, fire extinguisher, evacuation plan. Those are the major, I would say, major items to look for.
And again, I will just echo that the social worker is going to work with you on all these. And remember, with our first, we didn't have CO2 detectors on each floor. So that was something that we were missing from our home study. And we were able to Amazon next day delivery. I don't know how you ran out every single time, but good for you, Whitney.
Yeah.
We just Amazon next day delivery, and she was able to accept a photo of
Yeah.
where they were placed. And then at the next visit, really check that off of our list.
Absolutely.
How do agencies assess a family's financial stability, and what are the factors to consider during the evaluation process?
Okay. So this is also something that, case by case basis. For domestic adoptions, there's no rule of thumb. I would say for international adoptions, some countries have like a mathematical equation of how much the family has to make in order to satisfy their requirements. But if we're speaking about domestically, within the United States, we are really assessing the family, making sure that they're able to pay for not only their current bills, but if someone decides to stay home from work, and maybe not return to work full time, will they be able to match those same bills plus the child coming in, medical care, like we mentioned, daycare. That's a really big item to look into. Um, if a family has a great deal of debt, that's not a deterrent, but are they in some way, shape, or form trying to reduce that debt? Again, looking at what's coming in and what's going out. So there's a financial worksheet that's put together. We're looking at the family's liabilities, their assets, what type of budgeting they have in place. Do they have a budget? Should they get on a budget? So, it's really a snapshot of the family, each and every specific family, and what they have, what they're bringing in, what's going out, and then looking at, do they have what is going to be required to take care of another child or twins? I mean, I had a family one time, they turned down twins because of that daycare issue. They could not afford to put two children in daycare at their current financial situation, that's terrible. But at the same time, they took stock in what they had and what they wanted to do for this one child coming in. And so they knew what they were capable of and what would maybe put them in a great financial need if they decided to do a different type of adoption. So we really look at that, on a case by case basis, and just trying to make sure that families are not going to go into some kind of debt or not be able to, if they lose their job because they've taken off too much time from work, how are they going to afford that on a one income household? So, really trying to work with families. We're not financial managers or anything like that. But everybody has, their budget and, looking at ways that they can try to make it work as best possible for an upcoming adoption.
I'm really glad that you said debt isn't a deterrent, because I think, especially in the United States, we all have and we own some portion of debt.
Mhm.
And I know that, I'm not immune to that either. It was nice to be able to put that all together on the financial sheet or financial statement and just show that, there is light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to that debt, and we're marching towards that, even though we're carrying that debt. And that was really really impactful as a takeaway as far as that adoption home study process.
Sure.
Hey, Whitney, I have another question for you too that I've been hearing from families that I do calls with that, talks about their budgets and income and all of that. There's been some families that are self-employed, and, you obviously have to verify income, and typically families show that by supplying their W-2s. Is there anything that families who are self-employed that they need to do differently?
Usually, most states will accept their tax return. I mean, if you are self-employed,
Mhm.
you have to fill out a tax return, and that will show your income. Some states will require a letter from a tax provider, but again, if you're doing your own taxes, they will go back to the tax return. So there are multiple options for self-employed individuals. Maybe they have a bookkeeper or an accountant or someone that does their financial work, that can write a letter. So again, just being open and communicative with your caseworker if you're not getting like an actual paycheck. Some agencies require a letter from an employer, and that can be difficult if you're working for one of these really large corporations, going through HR and things like that. Sometimes just a couple of pay stubs, which is an old school term, but I've been doing it for a long term, or a screenshot of what you get, every month from your institution, wherever you get paid from, some kind of printout of that. So, sometimes people are getting a new job and they might not have gotten a paycheck yet. So we might look at their acceptance letter or their contract or something like that. So there's multiple layers of how you can provide that verification, but you have to be communicating with your caseworker. Like, I don't have a normal 9 to 5 job. I have XYZ. What do we do about that? And there's going to be some kind of option for them to provide that verification. Good question.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Perfect.
thank you.
Okay.
That was great. So I know we talked about this, this short little checklist that we're just going to march our way through. What are some common challenges to the home study process that cause delays or denials, and how can families avoid them?
Sure. So like I mentioned earlier, a denial, agencies do not want to deny a family. Um, that's just not something that they're working towards. That's not their goal. Um, but if that comes up, that family, if they have a written denial, that really will prevent them from their ability to adopt pretty much any time in the future. So if there's any way that an agency can work through an issue, um, they're going to stop the home study and try to seek out some resources for that family so that they can achieve an approval. Sometimes families just cannot. If you have some type of um, criminal or some kind of issue that has been against a child, and that's documented, whether it's a child protective services or some kind of crime that's been committed in front of a child, those are most likely not going to be approvable things. You would not be able to work through that. Sometimes people do have a child protective services background, and we have documentation that shows that, they worked through that. It wasn't something that they were in charge of. Maybe something happened to them. Again, supporting document, all that, being honest, upfront, forthright, we can work towards, making sure that that's something that we can work through. If someone has a DUI, or maybe in college they did some things, we can also use those kind of background checks. They're not going to deter you from being approved, but it has to be something that you have. We're going to ask you to provide documentation, whether you have a court history, some kind of something from your lawyer. That criminal background check will become something that we have to discuss in the home study. So any kind of supporting documents that they might have from where they went to in front of a judge, those kind of that supporting documentation will have to be provided to the agency. As far as delays, the checklist, there are certain things that I like to try to tell families to get working on first. Things like scheduling with your doctor. They might be 2 months out from scheduling, or you might not have an annual visit coming up. You may have to go into some kind of doc in a box or an urgent care. But looking at resources and trying to get on a schedule for that. Delays with getting your reference letters back. I tell families to start asking people to write their reference letters at the beginning, because those are some of the things that I'm always waiting for at the end. People just hang on to those, and it's such an important letter to them, but at the same time, they just can't produce it. So I will even tell my clients, I'll say, just give them a deadline. My mean caseworker said, if I don't have this back by March 1st or whatever the date might be, blame it on the caseworker. But giving them that space to write the letter, get it back to them. Um, Other delays might be as far as those background checks that we talked about. If you're looking at different states, sometimes they're 30 to 60-day timelines. And you can't always fax or email something. Sometimes they want it in the mail with a stamp, and it has to be notarized. So again, really breaking down each line item on that wonderful checklist, finding out what can I take care of today that's in my home office, what is going to take some scheduling, so I need to book out some time, what is going to take 30 to 60 days just to process to get it to that other state entity office, so that then they'll produce it back to me. So it's really being organized, coming up with your own timeline of expectations, and what are some things that are going to be longer ticket items. One thing that I guess we haven't talked about is filling out an autobiography or writing about yourself. That questionnaire that we ask families to either Q&A, we have an 18-page questionnaire that family have to fill out. That can take several weeks for someone to complete if they're not good at talking about themselves, writing about themselves, typing. So those are things to consider. You want the process to move forward in a systematic way. But if you're just sitting on something because you just can't get to it, that's going to hold you up. And that's going to take time away from you completing your process. So really kind of diving in deep on some of the things that are just sitting there that you just know you need to get the legwork running on can help move the process quick, more expeditiously, or just more systematically.
And I will just say, from my perspective, I think prioritizing those that you'll be waiting on other entities, either other people or other agencies, or sending paperwork to, and leaving the stuff that you can tackle on your own, whether it be the questionnaire or whatever, will alleviate a lot of stress. At least it did for me, because
Yeah.
then I knew when I was, when I needed to really sit down and work on things. Otherwise, it's a lot of it's a waiting game.
Sure.
Okay, so once the home study is approved, what are the next steps, and how long is the home study valid?
So once the home study is approved, and you might be doing some of this along the way. You want your home study to be syncing up with, as soon as I have this approval, where am I going to take it? So you want to have something in process, like I'm going to go now to an adoption attorney, or I'm going to make an application with a placement agency for the adoption, or I'm going to be using some type of coaching or consulting um, organization to help me get from the home study to this matching placement agency like ASA. So you really want to have some of that in process, in my opinion, while you're doing the home study. You can do those things simultaneously so that you're not spending the first 1 to 2 to 3 months after your home study is approved researching, where do I take my home study? So I'm encouraging my families to go ahead and be doing some of that during the time of the home study so that you can kind of hit the ground running. As far as the approval and how long it is valid before expiration, most states it's 12 months. So from the date of approval, it's 12 months, where if you surpass that timeline, you would have to update your home study. Now, within that, some of the documentation from that handy dandy checklist, those might have fallen off. You may have to update some of those supporting clearances or medicals or things during that 12-month time period. Let's just say you got all your stuff done immediately and your home study didn't finish up for a couple more months. Well, you may have to update a few things during that time. But yeah, you want to have some kind of idea of, I'm going to apply to ABC adoption agency, or I'm going to be working with my hometown adoption attorney, or I'm going to be looking at a step ahead and moving on with their process once my home study is done. So something like that.
Well, Whitney, thank you so much. I've skipped over a couple questions that I had in mind. I think, like you really stressed a lot of what was incorporated in some of those other questions. Even the
Okay.
next one I had talked about, those major life changes, which we've already said the home study process can be a lengthy one, making sure that we're open and honest and we're just, I say, over communicate with your social worker versus withholding information, and your home study should go smooth. Just as you recommended, I already had a step ahead adoption services in mind when I started pursuing, or at least when our family started pursuing our most recent adoption, which was very helpful because we were almost able at the end of our home study process to work in tandem with the step ahead adoption to move forward. So that is really good advice. So thank you for that.
Good.
Finally, I want to hear from Valerie. I know you've been jumping in. Thank you so much. How can a step ahead adoption help families through the home study process?
Yeah. So, Andy, you said that you already had us in mind when you were going through the home study process. And, I'll kind of just start there because we do have a lot of families that do that. They, are already working with a home study provider. And then they decide, I want to branch out. I want to use a consultant to broaden my horizons and, potentially get matched a little bit quicker with an expectant mom. So they come to us. So my suggestion for families that are in that process of the journey, to, be partway through the home study, at least get, all those background checks going, get the family history filled out, potentially schedule one of the in-home visits, and then reach out to us at ASA to say, hey, almost done with the home study. What do we need to do next to get moving with you guys? That's the perfect time for families to come on. So then they can start working on their profile book, because you must have a completed home study and your profile book done before you're able to move forward in our program and start reviewing expectant mom cases. So perfect way to use your time wisely is to, already be working on the home study, come in, start working on that profile book when you have just a few weeks left in the home study process. That way you're ready to go. Otherwise, I do have a lot of families that come to us who are brand new to the adoption world. They have a lot of questions. They are still trying to decide, what route are we going to take for adoption? Because when families come into this brand new, they all get overwhelmed with how many different routes you could take for your adoption journey. So when that is the case for you, you can sign on with ASA at the beginning of the process, and we will literally be there to hold your hand every step of the way. We would refer you to a home study provider in your state that we most commonly work with. It's not very often that we get a state where we haven't worked with a home study provider in that area. We have a lot of great relationships that have, been built over the last 25 years. And so we refer those families to those providers that we know and trust to get started. We also provide education hours because, like Whitney mentioned, there are some states that do require that. So if you are living in a state that does require certain education hours that you need a certificate for, we have a lot of resources that you can take advantage of to get those hours done. I know sometimes, families have to pay for certain education hours, but that is just part of our package deal. So no extra money is needed up front for that. So, you can go either way with it. You can come to us at the very beginning of your journey when, you are trying to decide which route is best for us. And we will walk with you through that home study process, as well as get you prepared with a profile book and get you ready to start reviewing cases. Or you can come to us partway through and, we'll just pick up wherever you're at in your journey. Even sometimes on that, we have families that have been working with another provider for a year, sometimes even 2 years. And they come to us afterwards and say, hey, we are wanting to use a consultant to once again broaden our horizons. So, we can really step in at any point a family needs us and begin to walk with them on their journey.
So I think, Valerie, I know you and I have talked about future episodes, but what a great opportunity to talk about profile books and what that looks like, because I know we've mentioned it a couple times, and I know we don't have time and we're not scheduled next episode, but something to look forward to, because that can be pretty daunting as well, especially if you're not used to talking about yourself. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll bring that to this group as well. As for today's episode, thank you both so much for sharing and coming on today's episode. The support that A Step Ahead Adoption Services extended through my family's journey was terrific. And so I'm thankful to share all of these details and really promote A Step Ahead Adoption Services. There's a lot of cost associated with adoption, and it was much easier to split up the home study costs and A Step Ahead adoption costs, where I wasn't writing a huge check. So if that big check is daunting, feel free to split it up like I did. Hope everyone enjoyed another episode. Remember, adoption really isn't a process, and I'm going to continue to say this because I feel like it's a tagline. It's a journey filled with love and resilience and hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and don't forget to be on the lookout for next month's episode, where we'll talk to Valerie some more about the difference between adoption agencies and consulting companies. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about Step Ahead Adoption Services, visit their website, www.stepaheadadoption.com, and thank you for listening.